August 15th, 1940. Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk, England. The cold night air pressed against the concrete walls of the Chainholme radar station, carrying with it the faint whistle of wind through the antenna towers that loomed like silent sentinels across the East Anglian coastline. Inside, Sergeant James "Jimmy" Whittaker hunched over the oscilloscope, the green glow illuminating his sweat-streaked face. Every twitch of the cathode ray tube signaled movement in the skies beyond. Each flicker a potential harbinger of destruction. The room smelled of ozone and heated electronics, a faint tang that reminded the young operator of the stakes at hand. Britain's survival hung by a thread, and in this cramped, humming hall of dials and switches, men like Whittaker had become the first line of defence against the Luftwaffe. Across the room, Lieutenant Charles Benson leaned forward, binoculars in hand, squinting at the glowing plots on the radar screen. "James, are we seeing what I think we're seeing?" he whispered, voice tight with disbelief. On the screen, a series of small blips had begun to cluster on the horizon, gradually expanding, spreading across the cathode ray tube with a slow, inexorable weight. Whittaker adjusted the gain and focus, heart thundering. "Hundreds," he murmured, as though speaking the word aloud could somehow contain the horror. It's hundreds of them." The Chainholme system, still relatively new and experimental, had been installed along the eastern coast to detect incoming enemy aircraft. Yet no simulation, no drill, could have prepared these men for the reality. A massive formation of Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Do 17 bombers, climbing toward London under the cover of darkness. The operators exchanged glances, the tension in the room thick enough to taste. "Plot their course," Benson ordered, his voice steady despite the fear. "Call the sector control. We need to know how fast they're moving and how soon they'll reach London." Radios crackled to life, voices hurried and clipped, relaying the information to Fighter Command headquarters in Bentley Priory. Every second counted. Every delay could mean lives lost in the streets of Britain's capital. Outside, the night sky seemed almost calm, the darkness broken only by the faint shimmer of stars. Yet in the minds of the operators, the sky was alive with menace. Radar blips moved across screens with chilling precision, translating invisible shadows into data that could, if acted upon quickly, give Britain its first warning of what the Luftwaffe was preparing. As the first warning messages crackled into sector control, Group Captain John Jack Hammond, perched on a high stool above the map room, traced the plotted courses with a finger. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly. "They're moving faster, and in far greater numbers than intelligence predicted. Prepare the squadrons. Scramble the Spitfires." In the control room below, Whittaker's hands shook slightly as he transmitted coordinates, guiding pilots toward the incoming threat. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. If these blips were misread, if speed or altitude were miscalculated, London could burn without warning. Every measurement, every calculation became a matter of life and death. Minutes passed like hours. Outside, the first distant hum of engines reached the ears of those stationed along the coast. Whittaker and his colleagues barely dared to breathe as the blips multiplied, forming a terrifying web that stretched across their screens. Each moment of clarity brought a simultaneous dread and awe. Britain was seeing the Luftwaffe on a scale previously unimaginable, and radar had revealed it first. Hammond's voice cut sharply across the room. "Report on altitude and formation. Tell me exactly where they'll be in 10 minutes. Whittaker adjusted dials and scribbled notes rapidly. "Altitude, approximately 12,000 feet. Heading southwest toward London. Formation spread over 20 miles. Estimated bomber count, 400. A hush fell over the room. 400 bombers. Britain's night skies, once dark and quiet, would soon be filled with fire, smoke, and the roar of engines. Yet the realization was also electric. The radar had given them forewarning. For the first time, the defenders could anticipate, could scramble fighters, could potentially intercept and save thousands of lives. As the night deepened, the radar operators continued their vigil, eyes fixed on the green glow of the screens. Every blip became a heartbeat. every movement a pulse of danger. In a quiet, tense synchrony, men in Suffolk and across the chain home network prepared for a night that would define the very survival of Britain. The first German bombers were still miles away, unseen to the naked eye. Yet the operators had already seen them. They had detected the storm before it arrived, and the British, for the first time in the war, felt both terror and a cautious hope. August 15th, 1940. Bentley Priory, London outskirts. The map room at Fighter Command headquarters was dimly lit, walls lined with charts, counters, and plotting boards that mapped the skies over Britain in meticulous detail. Group Captain John Hammond stood over a large table, his eyes scanning a series of chalk markers that traced the approaching bomber formations. The faint smell of oil, paper, and cigarette smoke hung in the air as officers moved with quiet urgency, plotting intercept courses and calculating fuel ranges for the Spitfires and Hurricanes ready to scramble. On the radar screens in Suffolk, the chain home operators continued to monitor the blips that marked the Luftwaffe's approach. Sergeant Whitaker's fingers danced across dials and switches, translating the data into actionable information. He spoke into the telephone, voice tense but precise. Sector 3, 400 bombers, heading southwest at 12,000 feet. ETA London, 25 minutes. Repeat, 25 minutes. Back at Bentley Priory, Hammond's aide, Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe, relayed the information to squadron leaders. Get the pilots ready. We have a large formation inbound. Scramble immediately when the order comes. Marlowe paused, noting the wide spread of the enemy blips. Sir, they're flying in tight formations. The Luftwaffe isn't playing. This is organized, deliberate. This could be the largest attack we've faced yet. Hammond ran a hand across his tired face. The British had been bracing for the Luftwaffe's onslaught for months, but radar was revealing just how enormous the threat truly was. It was one thing to anticipate raids, another to see in real time the staggering size of a bomber stream. Britain's industrial heart, its civilian population, and its nerve centres were all in the line of fire. And for the first time, Fighter Command could measure, minute by minute, the exact scale of the impending destruction. Meanwhile, across London and the surrounding counties, blackout precautions were underway. Residents curtained windows, extinguished streetlights, and took positions in shelters. In factories, workers paused to exchange anxious glances as the faint whine of distant engines became audible. Most had no idea that the radar operators hundreds of miles away had already detected the approach of the bombers. The chain home system had effectively given Britain a first glimpse into the storm before it touched the city. At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker and his fellow operators were a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. Each minute brought more data, more plotting, more frantic calculations. Range check, bearing 12-0, he called out, voice cracking slightly. Adjust altitude estimate. Some formations climbing faster than predicted. They're spreading out over 25 miles now. Lieutenant Benson nodded, rubbing his temple. Keep feeding that information to sector control. The squadrons are relying on every second of lead time we can provide. Without this, London might be sitting ducks. Outside, the night seemed deceptively calm. The wind whispered through the fields, and the faint glow of the moon reflected off dew-slick grass. From the ground, one could barely discern the advance of hundreds of bombers. Yet on the screens in Suffolk and the plotting boards in London, the reality was clear. The Luftwaffe's armada was immense, coordinated, and relentless. The British defenders were about to face an air assault on a scale few had imagined possible. Hammond, staring down at the plotting boards, issued orders with measured urgency. Scramble squadrons immediately. Intercept points at 6 miles west of the Thames. Altitude 12,000 feet. Spread in sections to cover the bomber stream's width. Timing is critical. Do not let them slip through. The clock ticked down. Whitaker's fingers hovered over the switches, eyes fixed on the ever-growing clusters of radar blips. Each flicker across the screen was a heartbeat of the approaching storm. For the operators, this was no longer a drill or a test. It was the reality of war made visible in green phosphor. The The data they transmitted now could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for the city below. As the minutes crept closer to the German formation's arrival, tension thickened in the control rooms and radar stations. Orders were double-checked, fuel levels verified, pilots briefed on enemy numbers, headings and altitudes. The calm of the night was a fragile illusion, shattered by the knowledge that within moments, Britain's capital would be under attack. Whitaker took a deep breath. Adjusting the radar frequency one last time, his eyes scanned the blips, which had multiplied and clustered like a living storm. "It's coming," he whispered. "We can see it all. And maybe, just maybe, we can stop it." August 15th, 1940, Thames Estuary, England. The first Spitfires roared into the night, their Merlin engines a sharp counterpoint to the distant, steady droning of the Luftwaffe bombers. Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe clutched the stick, eyes scanning the black sky, each shadow potentially a German Heinkel or Dornier. Below him, the faint glimmer of searchlights crisscrossed the fields and rivers, dancing across smoke and clouds as if choreographing the impending battle. "Formation spotted, bearing 275 degrees, came the crackling voice from Sector Control, fed directly by the chain-home radar operators at Bawdsey Manor. The Spitfires adjusted course instantly, slicing through the night air to intercept the approaching bombers. Marlowe's heartbeat accelerated. He had trained for this moment, but nothing in simulations could replicate the scale of the incoming formation. Hundreds of blips had become hundreds of aircraft, their silhouettes dark against the faint moonlight. Below, anti-aircraft batteries began to engage, tracers streaking upward as shells exploded in mid-air. The sky shimmered with the orange flashes of flak, illuminating bombers as they pushed forward toward London. Some crews braced, shouting over the roar of engines and wind, while radar operators transmitted constant updates, their precise data allowing British pilots to adjust altitudes and approach angles in real time. Marlowe's squadron dove into the bomber stream, splitting into sections to engage multiple targets. The Spitfires were fast, nimble, and armed with 8 Browning 303 machine guns. But the German bombers, flying in disciplined formations, were heavily armed themselves. Defensive gunfire ripped through the darkness, bullets whistling past the cockpit, scraping metal and leaving streaks of fire in the night. Meanwhile, at Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker's fingers flew over the dials. Every minute the radar provided an edge. Every second of lead time could save lives below. "Altitude dropping, formations converging on London's northwest sector," he called. "Squadrons redirected, intercept bearing 290. The operator's work had become the invisible eyes of Britain, transforming abstract blips into actionable intelligence. In the air, Marlowe's squadron engaged, firing into the Heinkel formations. Explosions lit the sky as bombers were hit, their fuselages torn open by tracer fire. Pilots weaved and banked, dodging defensive gunners while attempting to bring the enemy down before they reached the city. Every moment was a deadly calculus. Too slow, and civilians would die. Too aggressive, and the fighters risked destruction. At Sector Control, Hammond barked orders, coordinating Spitfire and Hurricane movements with pinpoint precision. "Marlowe, cover the east flank. Thompson, climb to intercept the second wave. Altitude 20,000 feet. Whitaker, keep feeding me every change in formation speed and heading." Each command was lifeline, each adjustment potentially preventing a bomb from hitting London. The first explosions from anti-aircraft fire marked the initial German losses. Yet the Luftwaffe pressed on relentlessly, maintaining altitude and course with terrifying discipline. The radar operators' screens continued to flicker, revealing gaps, clusters, and changes in heading that pilots exploited. Without these insights, the chaos of night combat over London might have overwhelmed the defenders. Marlowe's squadron reported several bombers destroyed, others damaged and breaking formation. The Spitfires had managed to disrupt the cohesion of the first wave, forcing some bombers to jettison their payloads prematurely over open countryside instead of the city. Small victories were celebrated with muted relief in the cockpit. Pilots were aware the night had only just begun. Back at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker exhaled, leaning back slightly from the radar console. "They're hitting some of them. Some of them are falling," he murmured, eyes never leaving the screen. Across the room, Lieutenant Benson nodded grimly. "We'll need to maintain this pace. The night isn't over, and there's more to come." As the second wave approached, the operators tracked each formation with painstaking precision. Altitude, heading, and spread were constantly updated and relayed to Fighter Command. For the first time in warfare history, technology allowed Britain to see the enemy before they were visible, to anticipate their moves, and to deploy defenders in a coordinated response. The night sky became a deadly tapestry. Tracer fire crisscrossing with moonlight, engines screaming, anti-aircraft shells erupting into clouds of orange sparks. Radar operators and pilots, though separated by miles, acted as a single organism, united by urgency, skill, and the knowledge that the survival of London hung in the balance. By midnight, the first wave had been repelled, but the blips on the radar screens revealed more German aircraft continuing their approach. The tension in the control room remained taut. Every blip meant lives on the ground, and the operator's role was far from over. Radar had given them an advantage, but the night was still young, and the Luftwaffe was determined to break Britain's resolve. August 15th, 1940, London, England. The city lay beneath an uneasy darkness, streets dimmed by blackout curtains, the faint flicker of gas lamps barely illuminating empty thoroughfares. From the ground, the first faint droning of engines was audible, a low, ominous hum that grew steadily as the night advanced. Citizens huddled in shelters, ears straining for the telltale crack of bombs or the whine of anti-aircraft guns. Few understood that hundreds of miles away, in Suffolk, radar operators were monitoring the precise movements of the Luftwaffe, giving Britain its first real warning. At Fighter Command headquarters, Group Captain Hammond leaned over the plotting boards, eyes tracing the blips as they approached the city. "They're converging on the Thames and the northwest sector," he said sharply. "Interceptors, get in position. Adjust altitude by 500 feet. Keep formation tight. Every second counts." The room was a flurry of movement, officers relaying orders by telephone, runners dashing with written updates, and scribes recording every piece of incoming intelligence. Meanwhile, in the skies above, Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron dove toward the bombers, engines screaming through the night air. Tracer rounds lit the darkness, weaving streaks of white and orange as bullets found their targets. One Heinkel erupted into a fireball spinning out of formation, smoke trailing behind it like a deadly comet. Pilots shouted over the roar of engines, adrenaline sharpening their senses. Each maneuver, each split-second decision, was a gamble with lives on the line. Below, the anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, their cannons belching flak into the sky. Explosions rocked the streets of London, the thunderous booms, shaking buildings and rattling windows. Civilians trembled in underground shelters, the sound both terrifying and strangely reassuring. The guns meant defence, meant hope, meant survival. At Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker's fingers never left the dials. Every movement of the enemy formations was tracked, plotted, and transmitted to Fighter Command. Altitude rising, heading correction to 285 degrees, multiple clusters forming, he reported, voice tight with focus. Each adjustment on the radar screens translated into real-time maneuvers for the Spitfires above. The operators had become the unseen eyes of Britain, the crucial link between threat and response. Marlowe's squadron engaged a tight formation of bombers near the Thames. The Spitfires weaved through defensive fire, some pilots narrowly avoiding tracer rounds that tore through the night. "Watch the flak!" Marlowe shouted into the radio. One of his wingmen, Flight Sergeant Collins, saw a Dornier explode beneath him, its debris scattering across the sky like deadly confetti. "They're falling fast, but more keep coming," Collins radioed back. Back on the ground, Londoners heard the distant hum of engines grow louder, punctuated by explosions and the intermittent crack of machine gun fire. Streetlights long extinguished gave the night an eerie blackness, making the flashes of anti-aircraft fire and falling debris more surreal, more immediate. For many, the war had suddenly become impossible to ignore. In the control room at Bentley Priory, Hammond barked precise instructions. Sector 4, redirect 2 squadrons to cover the east approach. Whitaker, keep feeding me every change in speed and direction. Don't let anything slip through. Sweat ran down his temples as he tracked the movements of hundreds of aircraft across the plotting boards. The chaos in the sky demanded calm and clarity on the ground. One miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. The radar operators, though unseen by the civilians below, bore the weight of the entire city on their shoulders. Each blip, each flicker on the screen, represented both a threat and an opportunity. They had detected the Luftwaffe first, and their vigilance allowed the Spitfires to intercept effectively. But the night was long, and waves of bombers continued to press toward London. Marlowe and his pilots fought with every ounce of skill, weaving, diving, and firing at enemy aircraft, their own lives a thin thread amid the storm. Explosions illuminated the night sky in harsh flashes, and smoke from burning bombers drifted across the city, tinged by the glow of distant fires. Radar updates guided them to the densest clusters, giving British fighters a crucial advantage. As the first hour of the Blitz drew on, both the operators and the pilots understood the magnitude of their role. Radar had changed the rules of engagement, turning what could have been blind terror into a calculated defence. Yet the scale of destruction looming over London was immense, and the defenders braced themselves for a night that would test courage, coordination, and endurance like never before. August 15th, 1940, Bawdsey Manor and London skies. By the second hour of the night raid, the Luftwaffe's formations had begun to stretch across the radar screens like an ominous web. Sergeant Whitaker's eyes were strained, muscles aching from hours hunched over the consoles, yet he could not afford to look away. Every flicker on the cathode ray tube was a harbinger of destruction, a signal that could save hundreds of lives if interpreted correctly. Multiple clusters approaching northwest London, estimated altitude 12,000 feet, speed 300 miles per hour, Whitaker called into the telephone. His voice was calm, precise, betraying none of the adrenaline surging through him. Each report was a lifeline, guiding Fighter Command squadrons to positions where intercepts could be most effective. The technology, still in its infancy, had already proven itself indispensable. Lieutenant Charles Benson stood nearby, calculating the intercept angles on paper, cross-referencing Whitaker's data with sector maps and known flight paths. Adjust Spitfire Squadron Delta to bear 295, concentrate on the central formation. If we can disrupt their cohesion, we may prevent significant damage to the city. His voice was measured, yet tension underscored every word. The margin for error was razor thin. London's fate hung on their precision. Above, the Spitfires and Hurricanes had begun to engage the bombers systematically. Groups of fighters sliced through the night air, engines screaming, bullets tearing through the darkness. One Heinkel He-111 spun out of control after a direct hit, smoke trailing behind it as it plummeted toward the Thames. Pilots exchanged quick reports over the radio. Target destroyed, central formation broken, adjusting bearing to next cluster. Hammond at Fighter Command followed every report, his eyes darting between plotting boards and incoming communications. Whitaker, give me continuous updates on all flanking formations. We can't afford any surprises. Marlowe, maintain altitude and pressure. Don't let them regroup. His commands were part coordination, part encouragement, part desperate hope. For the first time, radar had given Britain a fighting chance to anticipate an enemy assault on this scale. On the ground in London, air raid sirens wailed intermittently, warning civilians as incendiaries began to fall in outlying districts. Despite the darkness and chaos, the coordinated efforts of radar operators, sector controllers, and fighter pilots had managed to intercept a significant portion of the first bomber wave. Buildings shook, fires ignited, and yet London's defences, for the first time, were not completely blind to the approaching storm. Whitaker leaned closer to the console, noting the speed and bearing of the next cluster of bombers. Formation splitting, diverting east of the Thames. Estimated 20 minutes to central London. His voice carried a quiet urgency. knowing that the city now depended on the precise timing of fighter interventions. Each decision, each calculation, could determine the survival of countless civilians. At Bentley Priory, Hammond adjusted the plotting markers to reflect Whitaker's updates. He ordered squadrons to reposition, directing fighters into intercept paths that would maximize engagement effectiveness. Delta Squadron. Climb to intercept East Cluster, altitude 20,000. Alpha Squadron. Maintain pressure on central formation, keep them separated. The coordination between radar operators and fighter squadrons demonstrated a profound evolution in warfare. No longer were pilots relying solely on eyesight and intuition. Chain Home had turned night into a quantifiable battlefield. Radar's unseen signals had transformed uncertainty into actionable intelligence, giving Britain a tangible advantage against an enemy that had believed it could strike undetected. Marlowe and his squadron dove repeatedly into bomber streams, their engines roaring, tracers streaking the night. Explosions blossomed in the darkness as enemy aircraft were hit. 2 down, central formation still tight, adjust bearing to 300, Marlowe reported. Each confirmed kill was a small victory, but the threat remained overwhelming. The blips on the radar screens ensured fighters were not chasing shadows, but targeting real, coordinated formations. Hours passed like minutes as the night wore on. Whitaker's eyes ached. Benson's calculations grew more intricate, and Hammond's commands flowed without pause. Yet despite fatigue, a shared understanding held the room together. Radar had given them foresight, coordination, and a fighting chance. Without it, London might have been consumed in the first hours of the Blitz. By the early hours of the morning, the first wave of bombers had been partially repelled. Many shot down or forced to jettison their bombs over less populated areas. Radar operators at Bawdsey Manor continued their vigil, tracking retreating aircraft and monitoring for additional waves. The city had survived the first onslaught not through luck alone, but because unseen eyes had revealed the storm before it struck. August 15th, 1940. London, England. As the first wave of bombers receded into the distance, Londoners emerged cautiously from shelters, faces pale and eyes wide with exhaustion. The streets were littered with shattered glass, smouldering debris, and the lingering scent of smoke and burning timber. Fires flickered across rooftops, their orange glow painting the night in eerie patterns. Though much of the city had survived thanks to the coordinated defense, the toll on civilians and infrastructure was immediate and stark. In a small family shelter in Westminster, young Mary Carter clutched her brother tightly, listening to the distant roar of planes fading into the night. Her father, a volunteer fireman, returned with soot-streaked face and scorched uniform, muttering reports of collapsed roofs and damaged buildings. "We've been lucky tonight," he said quietly. "The fighters intercepted most of them, but we'll never forget what we've seen." Meanwhile, at Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker and his fellow radar operators allowed themselves a brief moment of relief. For hours, they had been the silent sentinels, interpreting faint green blips into actionable intelligence that directly saved lives. "We actually did it," whispered one young technician, voice trembling. "We actually guided them in time." Whitaker shook his head, exhaustion etched into his features. "Not yet. The night isn't over, and more may come. Every wave is a new challenge. Don't let your guard down." Lieutenant Benson walked the narrow aisle between consoles, checking readings and recalibrating instruments. He noted a pattern in the returning bomber data, clusters that had evaded initial interception. "Some slipped past Delta and Alpha," he murmured. "Next wave, we need to adjust altitude by 500 feet and widen our intercept spread. If we don't, civilians pay the price." The human cost was already apparent. Reports streamed in from fire brigades and ambulance units, detailing casualties, buildings destroyed, and the psychological toll of the sudden, violent intrusion. Yet every report was counterbalanced by the knowledge that radar had allowed Fighter Command to act decisively. Without it, the destruction would have been far worse. At Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond met briefly with his staff, reviewing the night's engagements. "We saved thousands tonight," he said, voice heavy with both pride and grief. But we cannot underestimate what we face. Radar is our advantage, yes, but we must maintain vigilance, efficiency, and courage. The Germans will return, and likely with even greater force. In the skies above, returning pilots touch down, engines winding down, hearts still racing from close encounters. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe climbed out of his cockpit, face streaked with soot and sweat. Squadron members exchanged tired but resolute nods. "Radar gave us the edge," he said softly. "Without those blips, we'd have been flying blind." Back at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker allowed himself a brief smile, glancing at the oscilloscope now showing only a few scattered blips of retreating aircraft. He thought of the civilians below, the pilots above, and the unseen technology that had transformed night into something manageable. Every flicker on the screen had represented a life, a building, a fragment of the city spared from immediate destruction. Yet amidst relief came exhaustion and tension. Operators knew that the Luftwaffe would not relent. The night of the Blitz had revealed the vulnerability of London, but it also demonstrated the power of foresight, coordination, and human ingenuity. Radar had shifted the balance, providing a crucial advantage, but it did not erase the dangers inherent in war. As dawn approached, Whitaker and his team continued to monitor for any stragglers, ensuring no bombers had been overlooked. The city, while battered and shaken, was still standing. Residents emerged cautiously, assessing damage, assisting neighbours, and mourning those lost. The first night of the Blitz had tested Britain's defences and its resilience, and while the human cost was tangible, the edge provided by radar had been undeniable. Hammond addressed his officers one last time before the sun rose. "Tonight we learned two things. First, we cannot underestimate our enemy, and second, we cannot underestimate our own capability to fight back. Radar is our eye in the dark. It has given us the power to act when the enemy thought we were blind. Remember that as we prepare for the nights to come." As light spread across London, the city began the slow process of recovery. Fires were extinguished, casualties tended to, and streets cleared of debris. In the quiet aftermath, radar operators prepared for the next night, knowing the Luftwaffe would return, and that their vigilance would once again be the invisible shield protecting a nation under siege. August 16th, 1940, Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk. The early morning mist clung to the antenna towers, dripping off wires and glinting in the pale light of dawn. Sergeant Whitaker wiped sweat and exhaustion from his brow, eyes still drawn to the radar console. The events of the night lingered in his mind. Hundreds of bombers, the deafening roar of engines, tracer fire, and explosions. Yet beneath the fatigue was a profound sense of realization. Radar had not merely detected the enemy, it had transformed the way Britain could fight, turning uncertainty into strategy. Lieutenant Charles Benson moved beside him, adjusting dials and jotting notes. "We've only scratched the surface," he said quietly. "The data we collected last night, we can use it to predict formations, flight paths, even the timing of attacks. We have an edge they don't even know exists." His tone was both awe and excitement. Unlike conventional defense, where forces reacted to visible threats, Chain Home allowed them to anticipate, to plan, to strike with knowledge that had previously been impossible. Across the room, junior operators compared notes, analysing discrepancies in blip readings, plotting predicted paths of retreating German bombers. Every detail was scrutinised, every anomaly investigated. It was painstaking work, but it solidified a truth. Radar was more than a technological marvel. It was now a critical instrument of warfare. In London, the significance of the previous night was beginning to filter into discussions among senior RAF officers. Group Captain Hammond convened a briefing with squadron leaders, reviewing after-action reports. "Last night, radar gave us sight where there was none," he emphasised. "We scrambled fighters with precise knowledge of altitude, heading and formation. This is a turning point. We must continue to refine our response and trust the Chain Home network." Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe, still recovering from the adrenaline and exhaustion of combat, nodded solemnly. "It's more than a warning system," he said. "It's our eyes in the dark. Without it, we'd have been reacting blind. Tonight, we were proactive, not reactive. That changes everything." At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker observed the faint residual blips of returning bombers, logging their final positions. His fingers ached from hours at the console, but he felt a deep, steady pride. "Every blip was a life we might have saved," he murmured. "Every calculation mattered. Radar didn't just warn, it guided, it protected, it gave hope." Outside, the first rays of sunlight illuminated the devastation below. Londoners walked through streets strewn with rubble, assessing damage, salvaging possessions, comforting neighbours. The physical toll was visible: buildings scarred, fires smouldering, and the lingering fear of the next night's raids. Yet there was also an unspoken acknowledgement of the invisible shield that had allowed many to survive. Radar had provided the crucial edge that human eyes alone could never achieve. Hammond and his officers studied charts, overlaying radar data with maps of the city, plotting predicted approaches for future raids. Each new calculation informed fighter deployment strategies, altitude adjustments, and response timing. The success of the night of August 15th was not seen merely in the number of bombers downed, but in the demonstrable proof that technology could amplify human decision-making in unprecedented ways. Whitaker allowed himself a rare moment to reflect. He thought of the pilots manoeuvring through tracer fire, the civilians huddled in shelters, and the vast, unseen waves of German bombers, whose approach had been detected first by green phosphor screens in Suffolk. In that quiet moment, he realised that radar had not only saved lives, it had fundamentally changed the course of Britain's defence strategy. As the day progressed, preparations for subsequent nights began. Operators recalibrated equipment, officers refined intercept strategies, and pilots briefed on intelligence derived from radar data. The human, technological, and tactical elements of Britain's defence were now intertwined, forming a sophisticated network capable of responding to the Luftwaffe with unprecedented precision. The night of August 15th had revealed more than enemy formations. It had revealed the potential of foresight, coordination, and technology in modern warfare. Radar, once experimental and doubted, was now a central instrument in the survival of Britain, providing the British people with a fighting chance against a seemingly insurmountable threat. August 16th, 1940, North Sea and Eastern England. From the German perspective, the night of August 15th had been a calculated strike, a test of strength, morale, and precision bombing over London. High above the North Sea, Luftwaffe commanders in their Heinkel 111s and Dornier Do-17s were unaware of the invisible eyes tracking their every move. Navigator Oberleutnant Franz Keller peered over his map table, squinting at plotted courses, believing the British to be reacting solely on visual spotting and intelligence reports. They had no concept of the new technology working tirelessly against them. "Formation Delta," Keller called to his radio officer. "Maintain altitude. Approach from the east as planned. Night cover will protect us." His confidence was unshaken. The Germans had assumed that the British radar network was either incomplete or incapable of providing actionable data in real time. The reality was far different. Every formation, every cluster of bombers had been tracked, plotted, and partially intercepted before a single bomb had been dropped. Back at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker and Benson monitored the return of the night's formations. "They're retreating faster than expected," Benson noted. "Some units aren't even heading home along their original paths. Radar may have forced them into erratic behaviour." Whitaker's fingers flew across the dials, confirming altitudes, headings, and dispersal patterns. The Luftwaffe's attempts to regroup were being countered by proactive interceptions informed entirely by unseen electronic eyes. Meanwhile, in Fighter Command, Hammond studied the recorded flight paths. "They underestimated us," he said aloud. "They thought darkness would protect them. Instead, radar turned the night into daylight for us. Every deviation we forced them into increased their vulnerability." Pilots returning from engagements reported disorganized formations, bombers breaking off prematurely, and gunners frustrated by persistent Spitfire harassment. Radar had not only allowed accurate targeting, but had disrupted the enemy's confidence and cohesion. In the skies, Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron remained vigilant despite fatigue. "They're trying to reorganize," he radioed. "Central formation is straggling, some aircraft peeling off north of the Thames. Keep pressure on them." His Spitfire sliced through the darkness, engines screaming as tracers tore through the night. Radar updates from Suffolk guided each maneuver, ensuring fighters were not wasting precious time searching blindly for targets. Back in Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began receiving incomplete reports of losses. "Our formations are disrupted," one officer admitted, frowning at the sparse data. "They've anticipated our approach. There must be some unseen system, something we did not account for." The realization was chilling. The Germans had assumed surprise, the cover of night, and numerical superiority would ensure success. Instead, they were encountering a defensive network that could predict, direct, and respond faster than their bombers could adjust. At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker logged every retreating aircraft, noting altitudes and speeds as pilots returned to occupied airfields. Each blip represented not only an enemy lost or displaced, but the efficacy of radar itself, a tangible measure of Britain's advantage. Lieutenant Benson, reviewing the data, said quietly, "This is more than survival. This is a lesson in how technology changes warfare. They didn't see us, but we saw them every step of the way." The Luftwaffe's miscalculation had strategic consequences. By failing to account for radar, German planners underestimated the British capacity for early warning, fighter interception, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire. Pilots, exhausted and disoriented, were forced to fly longer return routes, increasing fuel strain and exposing them to further risk. Each disrupted bomber carried not only the psychological weight of failure, but a growing awareness that their tactical assumptions were flawed. As dawn broke over eastern England, the full scope of the previous night's engagements became clear. Radar had transformed the British defensive posture from reactive to proactive, turning what could have been a devastating strike into a partially mitigated encounter. Hundreds of lives were spared, and London remained intact despite the terrifying scale of the Luftwaffe assault. Whitaker and his fellow operators knew that the Germans had not yet comprehended the full extent of Chain Home. The advantage was fragile, dependent on vigilance, accuracy, and coordination. Yet for the first time, Britain had concrete proof that the unseen technology in Suffolk could shape the outcome of the air war, challenging assumptions of enemy superiority and altering the strategic calculus for both sides. August 16th, 1940, Bawdsey Manor and Fighter Command headquarters. The morning after the first major radar-assisted interception was a flurry of activity, analysis, and rapid adaptation. At Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson pored over the night's data, cross-referencing every blip, every formation change, every anomaly recorded on the oscilloscope. Their fingers traced flight paths on paper charts, translating hours of green phosphor flickers into concrete tactical insight. "We need to map predicted routes for the next wave," Benson said, leaning over the console. "Look at the deviation patterns. They're adjusting altitude and spreading out to evade interception. If we can anticipate these shifts, our squadrons will have an even higher chance of engaging before they reach the city." Whitaker nodded, eyes scanning screens that still bore residual echoes of returning bombers. "Every movement is measurable. Radar gives us foresight they didn't anticipate. Let's make them pay for underestimating us." At Fighter Command headquarters in Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond convened a strategy meeting with squadron leaders. "Radar is no longer experimental. It's our force multiplier," he emphasized, tapping a map overlay with a gloved hand. "We can predict formation approaches, timing, and dispersal patterns. Our squadrons must adjust altitude, intercept angles, and engagement timing accordingly. Every second counts." Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe listened intently, reviewing the intercepted formations data from the previous night. "We were able to disrupt the bombers' cohesion," he said, "but the next wave may be larger and more organized. Using radar, We can force them into disadvantageous positions before they reach central London. We have a chance to maximise efficiency and minimise civilian casualties. Back at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker coordinated with the network of chain home stations stretching along the eastern coast. Data was relayed in near real time, blending multiple detection points into a coherent, predictive picture. Operators worked in synchronized shifts, ensuring that blips from incoming aircraft were continuously tracked and projected forward. Each report fed directly into Fighter Command's plotting rooms, allowing squadrons to position themselves with unprecedented accuracy. The importance of this integration was not lost on Benson. Radar alone isn't enough, he explained to Whitaker. It's only effective if Fighter Command can act on it immediately. The pilots, the squadrons, the anti-aircraft units, they all have to operate as one coordinated system. That's what gives us the edge. By afternoon, simulation exercises were underway to test various intercept scenarios based on last night's data. Squadron leaders reviewed altitude adjustments, engagement angles, and response times, cross-checking against radar projections. The emphasis was clear: reduce reaction lag, anticipate enemy behavior, and strike before the bombers could form tight formations over the city. In the field, pilots conducted mock flights, replicating approaches of the previous night's bomber streams. Marlow practiced maneuvers designed to exploit gaps in the German formations, following predicted paths calculated from radar intelligence. The combination of technology, human skill, and rapid feedback created a dynamic defense system, one that continuously adapted and evolved with each engagement. Meanwhile, at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker documented patterns of altitude variation, formation dispersion, and approach timing. Each report was relayed to sector control and integrated with Fighter Command's operational plans. They're adjusting every sortie, he noted. But we can see it coming. Radar doesn't lie. The British chain of observation, communication, and rapid response became a model of precision in wartime operations. By refining the system night after night, operators, officers, and pilots turned chain home from an experimental technology into a cornerstone of national defence. Its ability to detect, track, and predict enemy movements transformed Britain's response from chaotic reaction to proactive control. As dusk approached, preparations for the second night of the Blitz were underway. Civilians reinforced blackout precautions. Squadrons prepped aircraft, and radar operators recalibrated equipment. The lessons learned from August 15th had been applied and amplified. Radar had proven its worth, and Britain's defence apparatus was becoming a tightly synchronised machine, capable of responding to the Luftwaffe with a precision they had not anticipated. In the quiet moments before the night descended, Whitaker and Benson exchanged a glance. "They'll be back," Benson said softly. "But we're ready this time. Radar has changed the rules." Whitaker nodded, understanding that their vigilance would once again define the city's survival. The war in the skies over Britain had entered a new phase, one in which technology, courage, and coordination could shape the outcome as much as the pilots themselves. August 16th, 1940, London and surrounding skies. Night fell quickly over London, cloaking the city in a familiar darkness that had become both ally and enemy. The faint hum of engines approached from the east, and within seconds the radar screens at Bawdsey Manor flickered to life, revealing the first clusters of incoming German bombers. Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson were already stationed at their consoles, eyes scanning every blip, fingers poised over the dials. "Central formation, altitude 13,000, heading 280 degrees, Whitaker called. "Speed approximately 310 miles per hour, ETA 22 minutes. His voice was steady, betraying nothing of the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Every word mattered. Every calculation could prevent death and destruction below. At Fighter Command headquarters, Group Captain Hammond adjusted plotting markers and issued orders. "Scramble Delta Squadron immediately, climb to intercept altitude 14,000 feet. Alpha and Bravo, maintain coverage over the northern sector. Whitaker, continuous updates. Every cluster, every deviation, feed directly into our squadron's flight paths." The precision of these instructions demonstrated the evolution of Britain's air defence. Real-time intelligence now governed tactical deployment. In the skies, Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe led his Spitfires into formation, engines roaring against the night wind. The first glimpses of the Luftwaffe appeared as faint silhouettes against the moonlit clouds. Tracer fire streaked the darkness as German gunners opened fire, and explosions erupted around the bombers as anti-aircraft artillery engaged. Every movement was monitored by radar, every adjustment guided by operators hundreds of miles away. Marlowe's squadron dove into the fray, splitting into sections to cover multiple bomber clusters simultaneously. Central formation, target 2 Heinkels on the left flank, Marlowe instructed over the radio. Pilots executed coordinated attacks, using radar-fed positioning to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The Luftwaffe, unaware of the unseen surveillance, struggled to maintain cohesion, breaking formations under the precise pressure of British interception. At Bawdsey Manor, Whittaker tracked deviations, noting clusters attempting to veer north or south to evade engagement. East flank adjusting altitude. Heading 30 degrees off original path, he reported. Delta Squadron repositioning. Intercept in 5 minutes. Each transmitted update was a lifeline, translating technological insight into human action above the city. Back on the ground, Londoners huddled in shelters, the distant roar of engines and explosions vibrating through the streets. Fires from the previous night had been extinguished, but the threat now was renewed, sharper, more immediate. Civilians, though largely unaware of radar's role, would soon witness the effectiveness of Britain's evolving defence. As the battle intensified, the chain-home network became the nerve centre of an invisible battlefield. Radar operators coordinated multiple squadrons simultaneously, tracking clusters, predicting paths, and advising on altitude adjustments to optimise interception. It was a complex dance of speed, altitude, and timing, orchestrated in near real time, unseen yet decisive. Marlowe's squadron downed several bombers, their twisted wreckage falling in fiery arcs over the Thames and surrounding fields. One Heinkel, heavily damaged, veered into a factory district, narrowly missing a critical bridge. The precision of radar guidance had allowed fighters to engage efficiently, yet the human cost and randomness of war were unavoidable. Pilots shouted updates over radio, coordinating attacks that would have been impossible without the chain-home information feeding into every decision. At Bentley Priory, Hammond monitored the unfolding engagement, adjusting squadron assignments on the fly. Alpha Squadron, cover northern approach, adjust bearing 10 degrees. Bravo, intercept stragglers heading southeast. Whittaker, keep feeding real-time coordinates. I want full situational awareness. The plotting room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a defence operating at the limits of human and technological capability. As hours passed, the Luftwaffe's assault began to wane. The disruption caused by British fighter intervention, combined with accurate early detection via radar, forced many bombers to jettison their payloads over less critical areas. Radar had allowed strategic allocation of forces, guiding pilots to the highest value targets, and ensuring that the city's most vital areas were defended with maximum efficiency. By 4 a.m., the second wave had dissipated. Pilots returned, engines exhausted, faces streaked with soot and sweat, yet tempered with a quiet pride. At Bawdsey Manor, Whittaker leaned back, finally allowing himself a breath. The consoles still flickered faintly, echoing residual signals, but the immediate threat had passed. Radar had once again provided the edge that Britain needed, turning night from a lethal blind spot into a battlefield where intelligence, skill, and coordination could prevail. Hammond addressed his officers in the early morning hours. Tonight proved what we suspected. Radar isn't just an early warning, it's a weapon, a force multiplier. We saw enemy formations first, guided our pilots effectively, and mitigated destruction. The night of the Blitz has shown that foresight can be as deadly as firepower. Above London, the sun rose, illuminating a battered but still standing city. Smoke lingered, fires smouldered, and streets bore the scars of battle. Yet thousands of lives had been spared. Chain Home had turned uncertainty into action. fear into strategy, and darkness into a controlled, manageable threat. The technology, paired with human courage and coordination, had proven itself indispensable. August 17th, on Bawdsey Manor in London. The third day of the Blitz dawned with the air tense but resolute. At Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson reviewed radar logs from the previous nights, the glow of the cathode ray tubes reflecting in their tired eyes. Each blip, each formation path, each deviation from predicted courses was meticulously catalogued. Patterns emerged. German bombers were experimenting with new flight paths, adjusting altitude and spread, attempting to circumvent detection. "We're learning their habits," Benson remarked, tracing multiple intersecting lines across the plotting sheets. "Every night, we refine our intercepts, predict their maneuvers. Radar isn't just giving warning, it's teaching us the enemy's tactics." Whitaker nodded, understanding the full implication. This was no longer a mere tool for survival. It was an instrument of strategic advantage, turning hours of night terror into actionable intelligence. At Fighter Command, Group Captain Hammond convened a comprehensive briefing. Pilots, squadron leaders, and radar technicians assembled, a rare union of human skill and technological insight. "The Luftwaffe is adapting," Hammond warned, "but so are we. Radar allows us to anticipate, to plan, and to act. We will refine our responses and ensure that no formation penetrates undetected." Charts were spread across tables, overlaying radar data with maps of London, projected flight paths, and predicted dispersal patterns. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe studied these maps intently. "We're seeing repeated attempts to approach from different angles, sometimes in smaller, tighter groups. Radar gives us the edge to preempt these strategies, but the pilots must be ready to adjust instantaneously. Coordination is key." Across the room, his fellow pilots murmured agreement, recognizing that the invisible network of chain home had become as crucial as their own skill and courage. Back at Bawdsey, Whitaker and his team monitored activity across the North Sea approaches. "New wave detected, 32 aircraft, heading 275 degrees, estimated altitude 13,000, he reported. The blips moved in predictable clusters, yet subtle variations in speed and formation indicated that the enemy had learned from previous nights. Benson adjusted intercept recommendations, feeding precise headings and altitudes to Fighter Command. As dusk fell over London, the city prepared for yet another night of uncertainty. Civilians enforced blackout regulations, firefighters readied equipment, and hospitals braced for potential casualties. Yet a quiet confidence pervaded among those in command. Radar had shifted the paradigm. The chaos of night raids was now navigable, manageable, and to an extent controllable. The Luftwaffe returned in full force, larger formations this time, testing new approaches. But each movement was tracked, each deviation accounted for. Radar operators relayed information instantaneously, allowing fighter squadrons to intercept with precision. Explosions erupted in the night. Tracer fire streaked across the sky, and bombers were forced into evasive maneuvers. Marlowe and his pilots engaged with deadly efficiency. "Formation breaking," Marlowe radioed. "2 Heinkels down, central cluster disrupted. Keep pressure on the northern wing." Each engagement demonstrated the synergistic power of human skill, guided by technological foresight. Radar had become more than early warning. It was the invisible hand directing the outcome of battle in real time. By 3 a.m., the assault had waned. Pilots returned exhausted but alive, aircraft scarred but functional. Radar operators allowed themselves a rare sigh of relief, aware that their vigilance had once again preserved life and infrastructure below. Hammond reviewed post-mission reports, noting the increasing accuracy of interceptions and the declining ability of the Luftwaffe to penetrate defences undetected. The lessons were clear. Radar had transformed Britain's defence. It allowed anticipatory action, informed tactical decision-making, and disrupted enemy planning. More importantly, it demonstrated that warfare was no longer solely a contest of firepower or numbers. Knowledge, speed of information, and coordination could be decisive factors in survival and success. In the early morning light, Londoners emerged cautiously from shelters, assessing the damage. Fires smouldered, streets were littered with debris, but thousands of lives had been spared. Chain Home had proven itself not only as a technological marvel, but as a cornerstone of modern warfare, a tool that allowed Britain to survive, adapt, and fight back against overwhelming odds. Sergeant Whittaker and Lieutenant Benson, still at Bawdsey, reflected on the nights past. "We've changed the rules of engagement," Benson said quietly. "Radar has given us something more than warning. It has given us power." Whittaker nodded, fingers hovering over the console. The green phosphor screen flickered faintly, the silent sentinel of the unseen war above London. The battle for the skies was far from over, but Britain now had an edge that could not be ignored. August 18th, 1940, Bawdsey Manor and London's skies. Night fell with a tense, anticipatory quiet. At Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whittaker sat hunched over his radar console, eyes straining to discern the faint flickers that signalled approaching German aircraft. Each blip represented not only a bomber, but an entire formation's potential for destruction. Beside him, Lieutenant Benson adjusted the receiver, interpreting the data with the precision born of sleepless nights. "They're coming in larger numbers tonight," Benson said, noting the speed and altitude of the approaching clusters. 25 miles out, forming a crescent pattern. Estimated altitude 12,000 feet. Whittaker traced the blips with a trembling finger, realizing that these formations were the most coordinated yet. The Luftwaffe had learned to adapt, yet they had no idea the British had an unseen system predicting every maneuver. At Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond received the radar updates in real time. He issued orders with meticulous precision. "Delta Squadron, climb to intercept altitude 13,000, focus on Northern Crescent. Alpha, maintain pressure on Central Cluster. Bravo, prepare for flanking engagement east of the Thames." Every command was grounded in data, every maneuver informed by radar intelligence. Above London, Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe and his squadron of Spitfires roared into the night sky. Engines screamed, tracer fire cut through darkness, and the first Heinkels came into view. "Northern Crescent, engage!" Marlowe shouted. Radar guidance allowed each pilot to position perfectly, striking vulnerable points in formations before bombers could drop their payloads on the city below. The Luftwaffe, unaware of the invisible eyes tracking their every move, struggled to maintain cohesion. Pilots broke formation under pressure, evasive maneuvers slowing their advance, while British fighters exploited every gap. "2 bombers down," Marlowe radioed. "Central Cluster fragmented, pushing east." Each engagement was a testament to the integration of technology and human skill, a warfighting methodology that Germany had failed to anticipate. On the ground, Londoners listened to the distant drone of engines, punctuated by tracer fire and explosions. Fires illuminated streets in fleeting bursts of orange and red, reflecting off the blackened windows of buildings. Civilians huddled in shelters, tense yet reassured, unaware that radar had given the RAF a decisive advantage in guiding intercepts. At Bawdsey Manor, Whittaker monitored blips that indicated deviation in enemy formation, an intentional tactic to evade the expected fighter paths. "They're splitting again," he reported. "Northern wing heading northeast, Central Cluster maintaining heading, Southern formation retreating slightly." Benson adjusted calculations and sent updated bearings to Fighter Command. Intercept vectors recalculated. Delta and Bravo. Adjust headings 10 degrees. The second half of the night became a battle of adaptation. German bombers altered speed, formation, and altitude, trying to escape detection, while British radar operators tracked every movement with painstaking accuracy. The airspace became a chessboard, where knowledge and timing dictated the outcome more than sheer numbers. By 4 a.m., the assault had been largely repelled. Hundreds of aircraft had been forced off course, dozens destroyed, and London had survived another night of relentless bombardment. Pilots returned, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion, while radar operators logged the final positions of retreating formations. Chain Home had transformed night defence from reactionary chaos to coordinated strategic action. Hammond reviewed the data, noting the increased efficiency of interceptions and the declining effectiveness of enemy formations. "Radar has changed the game," he said. "The Luftwaffe's tactics no longer guarantee success. They will have to adapt or fail." In London, dawn revealed the aftermath: smoke drifting from scattered fires, rubble-strewn streets, and buildings marked by the previous night's strikes. Yet the city stood. Thousands of lives had been spared, and the RAF, guided by the unseen network of Chain Home, had proven that foresight could outweigh sheer destructive force. At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker allowed himself a brief, exhausted smile. "We've done it again," he murmured. "We've turned the night into something we can fight in." Benson nodded, knowing that radar had not just saved lives, but had redefined the nature of modern air warfare. The British advantage was real, and its consequences would echo far beyond a single night of the Blitz. August 19th, 1940, London and Bawdsey Manor. The air over London was thick with the lingering tension of repeated nighttime assaults. Yet beneath the exhaustion of pilots and civilians alike, a new element was emerging: confidence born of knowledge. At Bawdsey Manor, radar operators Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson watched the screens with a quiet intensity, realizing that their work had transcended simple detection. Every blip not only guided fighter planes, but also provided the city itself with a psychological edge, a reassurance that the unseen network was constantly protecting them. "We're not just seeing planes," Benson said, eyes fixed on the oscilloscopes. "We're seeing patterns, predicting outcomes, shaping the battle. That's power, and it's invisible to the enemy." Whitaker nodded, understanding that this invisible advantage was as significant as any physical weapon. The Germans could strike with bombs, firepower, and terror, but they could not see the radar that had become a guardian of the night skies. In London, civilians had begun to recognize the impact of this newfound precision. Reports of bombers being intercepted before reaching critical targets circulated quickly. Families whispered about the efficiency of the RAF, the uncanny accuracy with which fighters seemed to know where and when to appear. Fear was still present, but it was tempered by a sense of protection that had never existed before. Blackout drills continued with renewed purpose, but there was an undercurrent of hope. The invisible eyes of radar gave people a fighting chance. At Bentley Priory, Hammond debriefed returning pilots. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe, face streaked with soot and fatigue, emphasized the transformative nature of the defense. "It's like we can see through the night," he said. "The enemy thinks they're unseen, but we're always a step ahead. Radar gives us foresight, and that changes everything." Other pilots nodded in agreement, some too exhausted to speak, but sharing the unspoken acknowledgement that the network of detection and coordination had shifted the balance. Back at Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker noted an unusual pattern in the incoming Luftwaffe formations. "They're hesitating, breaking formation earlier than expected," he observed. "They've started to recognize, perhaps subconsciously, that we know their paths. Radar is shaping their behavior without them even realizing it." Benson adjusted the plotting maps, projecting potential deviations and relaying instructions to Fighter Command. "Every hesitation, every premature maneuver increases their vulnerability," he said. "We're controlling the battlefield." The psychological impact extended beyond the operators and pilots. Fire brigades, ambulance crews, and civil defense personnel began to coordinate more effectively, guided by the knowledge that RAF fighters were responding with precision. Morale among civilians, though strained by repeated bombings, was bolstered by tangible proof that the city's defences were active and effective. Radar had transformed the night from a source of paralysing fear into a theatre of calculated resistance. Meanwhile, German pilots faced mounting frustration. Oberleutnant Franz Keller and his comrades noticed repeated disruption in formation, unanticipated interceptions, and losses that were increasingly difficult to explain. Reports of precise British fighter engagement began filtering back to Luftwaffe Command, sowing confusion and uncertainty. The psychological edge gained by Britain was now mirrored by doubt and hesitation among their enemies. At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker and Benson worked through the night, feeding continuous updates to Fighter Command, monitoring enemy movement, and ensuring that every deviation was met with a precise countermeasure. Every successful interception reinforced the growing realization radar had not merely leveled the playing field, it had fundamentally altered the psychology of the air war. As dawn approached, Londoners emerged cautiously, assessing damage and tending to the wounded. Fires smouldered, streets bore scars, yet a sense of resilience permeated the city. Radar had not only saved lives, but had provided hope, transforming fear into a tangible, actionable understanding that the night skies were no longer entirely hostile. In the quiet aftermath, Whitaker allowed himself a brief reflection. "They think they have the night, but we see everything," he whispered. Benson smiled faintly, understanding the full implication. This was not just technology, it was a force multiplier that reshaped human perception, decision-making, and courage in the darkest hours. August the 20th, Muckyfon, Bawdsey Manor and London. By now, the chain home network had matured into a finely tuned defensive system. Radar operators at Bawdsey, including Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson, had developed routines and protocols that transformed raw data into actionable intelligence with remarkable speed. The oscilloscopes, glowing faintly in the dimly lit control room, tracked incoming formations with astonishing clarity. Every aircraft, every deviation, every subtle change in speed or altitude was noted, analysed and transmitted to Fighter Command in real time. "We're seeing more patterns than ever," Benson said, leaning over the plotting tables. "The enemy is trying different approaches, but their responses are predictable. We can anticipate where they'll break formation, how they'll adjust, and which squadrons we need to deploy." Whitaker nodded, fingers poised over the dials. The night skies had become a chessboard, with radar serving as the eyes and hands of an invisible strategist. At Bentley Priory, Hammond convened another briefing with squadron leaders. "Tonight, our goal is to maintain proactive engagement," he instructed. "Radar will guide us, know the clusters, know the altitudes, and engage decisively, minimize risk to civilians, and maximize pressure on enemy formations. Precision, timing, and coordination are key." Charts and maps displayed predicted paths and potential interception points, reflecting the continuous learning of radar operators and the refinement of Fighter Command strategies. As night fell, the first signs of incoming Luftwaffe formations appeared on the screens. "Northern approach, 20 aircraft, altitude 12,000 feet, heading 280 degrees, Whitaker reported. Each blip was a warning, a signal, a life saved before it was even in danger. The operator's meticulous tracking allowed fighter squadrons to climb to the optimal altitude and intercept in precise vectors, cutting through darkness with calculated efficiency. In the air, Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron responded seamlessly. "Northern cluster engaged, 2 bombers down," he radioed. "Central formation breaking. Bravo squadron move to intercept." Every maneuver had been rehearsed, every adjustment informed by radar intelligence. The night had become a controlled battlefield, where anticipation and coordination replaced blind reaction. The Luftwaffe's attempts to evade detection were increasingly frustrated. Pilots altered formation and speed, yet Chain Home had already accounted for multiple scenarios. Each deviation was met with a pre-calculated intercept path, ensuring that even bombers attempting to escape detection could not avoid engagement. The unseen system imposed a kind of inevitability on the night air war, forcing the Germans to confront a reality they could neither see nor fully comprehend. On the ground, Londoners remained vigilant, huddled in shelters, but increasingly reassured. News spread of successful interceptions, of bomber losses, and of the growing efficacy of Fighter Command. The psychological impact of knowing that radar was providing real-time protection cannot be overstated. For the first time, the city understood that the unseen network above was not merely a technological curiosity, it was a shield, a guardian in the darkness. At Bawdsey Manor, Whitaker documented the night's activity with precision. Each radar blip, every deviation, every successful interception was logged, creating a detailed record that would inform strategies for nights to come. Benson worked alongside him, calculating potential adjustments for enemy behavior, refining intercept vectors, and ensuring that the intelligence flowed seamlessly to the pilots in the sky. By dawn, the latest wave had been repelled. Pilots returned weary but alive, aircraft battered but functional, and radar operators prepared for the next night. London, though scarred by incendiaries and debris, had survived another test. Chain Home had solidified its role as the backbone of Britain's night defence, proving that technology, when paired with skilled operators and coordinated command, could decisively shape the outcome of battle. Whitaker finally allowed himself a moment to step outside, the early morning mist clinging to the towers and wires. "We've done more than detect them," he whispered to Benson. "We've changed the night itself. The Luftwaffe can fly, but they cannot hide, not from us." Benson nodded, watching the first rays of sunlight illuminate the city below. Radar had not only saved lives, it had redefined what it meant to defend a nation in total darkness. August 22nd, 1940, Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk. While radar's technological brilliance had proven decisive, it was the human element, the operators, interpreters, and coordinators that transformed raw data into life-saving action. Sergeant Whitaker, Lieutenant Benson, and their fellow operators understood the weight of every decision. The green phosphor screens were more than blinking lights. They were the eyes through which London's survival could be assured. "Look at this," Whitaker murmured, pointing to the clustered blips forming over the North Sea. "We can see their patterns, anticipate their breaks, and guide every squadron precisely, but it's up to the pilots to act on it, and up to us to interpret it correctly." Benson nodded, adjusting the plotting maps. "Every second counts. One error, one missed blip, and lives below are at risk. It's not just technology, it's judgment, focus, and endurance." Operators worked in relentless shifts, eyes straining against fatigue, ears attuned to faint crackles of radio, fingers moving over dials and plotting charts with almost surgical precision. Each incoming formation demanded instant analysis, predicted altitude, heading, speed, and potential deviations. Recommendations were transmitted directly to fighter command and squadrons, forming a real-time chain of decision-making that was both delicate and unyielding. In the air, Flight Lieutenant Peter Marlowe and his fellow pilots had grown accustomed to relying on these invisible cues. "We wouldn't be here without them," Marlowe said quietly to his wingman before takeoff. "Radar operators give us the map through darkness. They're the unsung eyes of the battle." The pilots' trust in the operators created a seamless feedback loop. Detection informed action, action created results, and results reinforced the operators' decisions. At Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond emphasized the human factor in strategic briefings. "Technology is only as effective as those who wield it," he told his officers. "Radar provides insight, yes, but judgment, coordination, and courage are essential. The operators, the pilots, and the support staff, all of you form the backbone of Britain's air defence." Charts displayed multiple nights of engagement, showing not just aircraft positions but human decisions made under extreme pressure. Meanwhile, Londoners experienced the tangible benefits of these unseen efforts. Civilians reported that bombers were being intercepted earlier, that fires were confined, and that the accuracy of enemy bombing seemed inconsistent. While the public did not understand the intricacies of Chain Home, they felt the confidence that came with knowing someone, somewhere, was watching, guiding, and protecting them. At Bawdsey, fatigue was constant, but so was focus. Whitaker and Benson understood that their vigilance had consequences far beyond the control room. Each correct prediction saved lives. Each error could prove catastrophic. Benson adjusted the dials once more, feeding information to the plotting rooms. "Central cluster, northeast deviation anticipated in 5 minutes, he reported. "Delta Squadron ready for intercept." The Luftwaffe, unaware of the human-machine synergy they faced, continued their night operations under the false assumption of surprise and concealment. Pilots struggled against coordinated responses they could neither predict nor understand. The chain home operators' continuous vigilance created a cascading effect. Formation breaks led to missed targets, increased losses, and mounting frustration. The human element behind the technology amplified radar's strategic impact, turning the night into a carefully managed battlefield. As dawn approached, pilots returned, weary yet alive. Radar operators compiled data, cross-referenced observations, and prepared for the next wave. Every successful intercept was a testament not only to technology, but to the endurance, judgment, and resilience of those operating it. Whitaker, leaning back from the console, allowed himself a brief sigh. "The machines may detect," he said softly, "but it's our minds that make them lethal." Outside, London stirred. Fires smouldered in remnants of bombed-out buildings, but the city had survived yet another night. The unseen synergy of technology and human skill had ensured its preservation. Radar had given Britain foresight. The operators had given it effect. Together, they had altered the course of the Blitz, proving that innovation, courage, and discipline could rewrite the rules of war. August 24th, 1940, London and the eastern approaches. The Luftwaffe's attacks intensified, bringing with them waves of bombers larger than any previously seen. From Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson watched the radar screens with heightened vigilance. The phosphor-green glow revealed formations approaching in a tight crescent-shaped pattern, their speed and altitude meticulously calculated. "We've got the largest wave yet," Benson said, adjusting the plotting board. Northern Cluster, 36 aircraft, altitude 12,000 feet. Central Cluster, 32, altitude 13,000. ETA, 22 minutes. At Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond issued rapid orders to squadrons stationed across southern England. Delta, scramble immediately. Intercept northern wing. Alpha, Central Cluster, vector 12,000 feet, bearing 280. Bravo, southern flank. Be ready for evasive maneuvers. His voice carried authority and urgency, the weight of responsibility clear in every command. Every second mattered. Every pilot's action could prevent catastrophe below. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his Spitfire squadron climbed into the night sky, engines screaming against the wind. Clouds streaked with the faint reflection of moonlight, and distant tracer fire illuminated the first waves of enemy bombers. "Northern Cluster, engage!" Marlowe called over the radio, his voice tense but steady. The pilots executed precision maneuvers informed by radar updates, striking bombers before they could release their deadly payloads. Back at Bawdsey, Whitaker tracked deviations in formation. Central Cluster splitting, 10 aircraft moving slightly southwest. "Adjust vectors for Alpha Squadron immediately," he reported. Benson quickly relayed updated instructions to Fighter Command. The seamless coordination between operators and pilots allowed interceptions to occur in precise moments, maximizing effectiveness while minimizing risk to the city below. The Luftwaffe's frustration grew with each failed run. Oberleutnant Keller observed his formations breaking under pressure, the British fighters appearing with uncanny timing and accuracy. Bombers were forced to release ordnance over less critical areas or retreat entirely, their original plans rendered ineffective. Germany's pilots faced the tangible consequences of an unseen adversary, their morale slipping as every wave met resistance stronger and more coordinated than anticipated. At Bawdsey, the operators continued to analyze incoming formations, calculating altitudes, headings, and predicted evasions. Every new tactic from the Luftwaffe was anticipated and countered. "They're attempting a low-altitude approach to evade radar," Whitaker noted. "We've adjusted Delta Squadron's climb vectors. Interception in 3 minutes." Benson nodded, feeding the information directly into plotting boards and communicating with pilots already in position. On the ground, Londoners huddled in shelters, the city vibrating with the distant roar of engines and the impact of bombs. Fires lit portions of the skyline, but damage was mitigated. casualties limited by the efficiency of radar-directed defences. For the first time, the population began to feel a measure of control amidst chaos, a quiet reassurance that unseen guardians were orchestrating a defence from above. Marlowe's squadron engaged the bombers with deadly precision. Heinkel and Dornier aircraft fell under concentrated fire, some spiralling into the Thames, while others crashed in open fields outside the city. "Central cluster broken," Marlowe radioed. "Delta Squadron, cover northern stragglers." Each manoeuvre was a testament to the synergy of radar intelligence and pilot skill, demonstrating that Britain's technological advantage had matured into operational dominance. By 5 a.m., the largest wave of the Blitz to date had been repelled. Pilots returned, exhausted but alive. Aircraft battered but serviceable. Radar operators logged every blip, every deviation, and every successful interception, ensuring a detailed record for ongoing analysis. The chain home system had not merely defended the city, it had dictated the terms of engagement, controlling both the battlefield and the enemy's response. In London, dawn revealed smoke rising from the outskirts, broken windows reflecting the early sunlight, and streets littered with debris. Yet the city had endured, its people alive and increasingly confident in their unseen defenders. Whitaker, finally stepping outside into the early morning air, observed the horizon. "They think they can overwhelm us with numbers," he said quietly to Benson. "But knowledge, foresight, and coordination win the night." Benson smiled, understanding the profound truth. The combination of human skill and technology had reshaped the aerial war over Britain, giving them an advantage the Luftwaffe could not overcome. August 25, 1940, Bawdsey Manor, and the skies above England. The nights had grown longer, darker, and more intense. Yet the RAF and chain home operators had settled into a rhythm that turned chaos into order. Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson moved between consoles, coordinating the flow of information with unerring precision. Every radar blip was more than a signal. It was an opportunity to save lives, to disrupt the enemy, to assert control over a war that could easily have overwhelmed Britain's cities. "They're changing tactics again," Whitaker noted, pointing to a blip cluster deviating from its expected path. "Central cluster descending slightly, low-level approach." Benson quickly adjusted the plotting maps and radioed instructions to Fighter Command. "Alpha Squadron, adjust altitude intercept, 13,000 feet, heading 275, northern cluster remains standard." Every adjustment was a precise countermeasure, reflecting the flexibility and adaptability of the radar network. At Bentley Priory, Group Captain Hammond briefed squadron leaders. "The Luftwaffe is attempting unconventional approaches. Our advantage lies not in numbers, but in information. Use it to anticipate, position, and strike. Trust the guidance from the radar operators. They are the eyes we cannot afford to lose." Charts and flight path diagrams were displayed, illustrating predicted maneuvers, potential evasions, and interception points. The officers nodded, aware that the integration of technology and human judgment had created a decisive edge. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron ascended into the night sky. Engines screaming against the wind, the first enemy formations appeared on the radar, moving with a deceptive low-altitude profile designed to evade detection. Yet chain home operators had already accounted for this strategy. Northern cluster descending to 11,000. Vector for Delta Squadron updated, Benson relayed. Pilots adjusted altitude and heading with precision, positioning themselves to strike before bombers could reach their intended targets. The Luftwaffe, unaware of the invisible web guiding the RAF, struggled to maintain formation. Pilots broke apart, tried evasive maneuvers, and faced concentrated fire from well-positioned British fighters. Oberleutnant Keller's frustration grew with every interception. "Our plans are failing," he muttered to his wingmen. "They anticipate our every move, as if they can see through the night itself." Back at Bawdsey, radar operators monitored secondary waves, ensuring that stragglers and smaller groups of bombers were detected and vectored into intercepts. Whitaker traced each blip meticulously, his finger moving along the plotting board as Benson relayed instructions. Southern wing, engage stragglers at 12,000 feet. Alpha and Bravo coordinate, he instructed. The coordination between detection, communication, and action had reached near perfection. On the ground, Londoners endured another night of sirens and distant explosions. Yet the increasing efficiency of interceptions kept destruction and casualties lower than earlier raids. Confidence grew alongside vigilance. Citizens recognized, even if only intuitively, that radar had shifted the balance in Britain's favor. The invisible chain of detection and defense provided a psychological anchor amid the terror. Marlowe's squadron engaged the bombers with lethal precision. Explosions illuminated the clouds, aircraft spiraled into the Thames, and formations crumbled under the pressure of coordinated attacks. Each successful interception validated the months of labour, innovation, and human endurance invested in the chain home system. Radar had transformed night defence from reactive survival into proactive control. By 5 a.m., the skies cleared. Pilots returned, weary but intact. Aircraft damaged but airworthy. Radar operators logged every event, analysed deviations, and refined predictions for future attacks. Chain Home had consolidated its role as the backbone of Britain's night defence, not only providing early warning, but shaping the very tactics of the Luftwaffe. In the quiet hours of dawn, Whitaker stepped outside and breathed in the cool morning air. Smoke drifted from fires scattered across the city, but London had survived yet another night. "We control the night now," he said softly to Benson. "Not just with machines, but with every hand, every mind, every decision made in the dark." Benson nodded, watching the sun illuminate a city that had become more resilient, more adaptive, and more alive because of the invisible guardians tirelessly working behind the screens. August 26, 1940. Berlin, and the skies over England. In Berlin, the reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance and pilot debriefings painted a troubling picture. Oberst Hans Jeschonek examined the latest operational logs, noting increasing losses, disrupted formations, and reduced bombing effectiveness. "Our night operations are being compromised," he said, voice tight with frustration. "We are flying blind against a force we cannot see, cannot predict. And yet, they anticipate us perfectly." German pilots felt the invisible hand of British strategy with every sortie. Oberleutnant Keller recounted in his log, "We execute manoeuvres as trained. We climb and descend, alter our approach. Yet they appear in perfect position, striking formations before we can respond. It is as if the night itself conspires against us." Morale began to falter. Confidence in mission success, once a source of pride for Luftwaffe crews, was eroded by the relentless efficiency of radar-guided interception. Meanwhile, at Bawdsey Manor, Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson continued to observe the tactical patterns emerging from German adaptation. "They're trying lower altitude approaches," Whitaker said. "But we've anticipated it, and Delta Squadron is already positioned for intercept." Benson adjusted the plotting charts, calculating timing and vectoring for multiple squadrons. "Every adjustment they make only confirms the pattern," he noted. "Radar has given us more than a tactical advantage. It's reshaping their decision-making." At Bentley Priory, Hammond convened a strategy meeting with Fighter Command officers. "The enemy is reacting to our system," he said. "Every formation break, every evasive maneuver is evidence of the psychological pressure we exert. This is a war of minds as much as machines. Our pilots, guided by radar, can anticipate actions before they occur, effectively dictating the course of engagement." The officers understood the significance. Chain Home was more than early warning. It had become a tool of influence, shaping enemy behaviour through foresight and precision. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron ascended once more, engines screaming into the darkness. They engaged multiple bomber formations with surgical efficiency. Radar updates guided each manoeuvre, allowing pilots to strike the most vulnerable points while minimizing risk. Blinding tracer fire cut through clouds. Incendiary rounds lit up the night sky. and Heinkel and Dornier aircraft plummeted to the Thames or surrounding countryside. Each success reinforced the psychological impact on German crews, undermining confidence and sowing doubt. On the ground, Londoners began to internalise the pattern. While the Blitz raged, reports of successful interceptions circulated quickly, bolstering morale. Civilians realised that the city was not defenceless, that invisible eyes were protecting them, and that technology, combined with human vigilance, was altering the very nature of the threat. The psychological effect of knowing that protection existed, unseen yet effective, was as profound as the physical interceptions themselves. Back at Bawdsey, Whitaker observed a change in the blip patterns. Central formation is hesitating, delaying descent by 2 minutes, he noted. They are reacting to what they cannot understand, our presence, our predictions. Benson nodded, appreciating the subtle victory. Radar had not only detected but had influenced enemy behaviour, creating hesitation and disruption even before the first engagement. As the night wore on, the Luftwaffe withdrew with significant losses and minimal strategic gain. Pilots returned to their bases exhausted, their faith in conventional tactics shaken. Oberleutnant Keller recorded in his log, "We are confronting an enemy that sees us before we see them. Each raid grows riskier, each success harder to achieve. We are fighting shadows and losing." Dawn revealed London, scarred yet resilient. Fires smouldered, rubble littered streets, but the city's spirit endured. Radar had transformed the night air war from one of uncertainty and vulnerability into one of control and confidence. The psychological impact on both defenders and attackers had shifted the balance of power in a struggle that extended beyond bombs and planes. It was a war of perception, anticipation, and unseen strategy. Whitaker stepped outside, the pale morning light casting long shadows over the grounds of Bawdsey Manor. "They fear the night now," he said quietly to Benson. "Not the darkness, but what moves through it, what they cannot see. That is the real power of what we do here." Benson nodded, knowing that the combination of human skill, technological innovation, and psychological influence had made Britain's defence formidable, decisive, and enduring. August 27th, 1940. London and Bawdsey Manor. The Blitz had reached a critical point. The Luftwaffe's raids were relentless, yet the city endured. Its survival increasingly owed to the quiet, tireless work of radar operators. Sergeant Whitaker and Lieutenant Benson, eyes still fixed on glowing screens, monitored the final waves of the night. Each blip represented not just enemy aircraft, but an opportunity to protect lives, to anticipate movements, and to guide pilots with precision that had grown almost instinctive. "Central cluster splitting early," Whitaker noted. "Delta Squadron, intercept southwest flank. Northern cluster remains unchanged." Benson relayed updates seamlessly to Fighter Command. The coordination between observation and action had evolved into a symphony of timing, intelligence, and human judgment. Every decision mattered. Every movement of every aircraft could spell safety or destruction. Flight Lieutenant Marlowe and his squadron engaged the final wave with deadly efficiency. Heinkel's and Dornier's were intercepted, formations shattered, bombers forced to release ordnance over open fields rather than populated areas. The Luftwaffe's frustration was evident. Pilots had begun doubting their ability to succeed against an enemy who seemed always one step ahead. Back at Bawdsey, Whitaker allowed himself a brief reflection. "It's more than machines," he whispered to Benson. "It's every mind, every hand, every calculation in the dark. We're not just defending London, we're shaping the war itself." Benson nodded, understanding the profound impact of their work. Radar had not only saved lives, it had redefined how wars could be fought, turning information into strategy, anticipation into survival. In London, dawn broke over a city scarred by smoke and debris, yet alive. Civilians emerged from shelters, witnessing the aftermath of destruction tempered by the knowledge of protection. Fires smouldered, streets were littered with rubble, but thousands of lives had been preserved thanks to the invisible guardians of the night skies. The chain-home system, combined with the bravery and skill of its operators, had proven decisive. Radar had transformed night defense into a force multiplier, giving the RAF the ability to see, predict, and control engagements before the enemy even realized they were under observation. The psychological edge, the strategic foresight, and the technological mastery had collectively shifted the balance of the air war. Whitaker and Benson walked across the dew-soaked grounds of Bawdsey Manor as the sun rose. They thought the night was theirs, Benson said quietly. But it never was. Whitaker looked out toward the horizon, the distant spires of London visible through morning haze. We gave them a city, he replied, not through bombs or guns or planes alone, but through vision. The Blitz would continue, and the challenges of war were far from over, but on that dawn, the victory of foresight, innovation, and human endurance stood clear. Radar had changed the course of Britain's air defence, protecting the city and inspiring confidence in a nation under siege. It was proof that even in darkness, the combination of technology and courage could illuminate the path to survival and, ultimately, triumph.